My coworker spent 8 months trying to get me fired by stealing my work and presenting it as her own. I waited, documented everything, and then torpedoed her career-making presentation with the help of metadata. In the spring of 2021, I was 3 years into a job I genuinely loved at a mid-sized marketing firm in Austin, Texas. I was a senior content strategist, which sounds more important than it is, but was, in practice, a role where I had significant creative latitude and made meaningful contributions to client campaigns. I was well regarded by most of my team, was up for a promotion I'd been told was essentially settled, and had no particular enemies. Then my team acquired a new member. Her name was Andrea, and she had been brought in as a content manager, one level below my senior role, after apparently impressive interviews and strong references. She was sharp and personable in meetings, and had the specific skill of making managers feel like she was agreeing with them, while subtly redirecting conversations toward her preferred positions. If I were being neutral, I'd describe her as ambitious. If I'm being accurate, I describe what followed as an 8-month systematic attempt to undermine my position, steal my work, and replace me. It started small. Ideas I'd shared in planning sessions that I hadn't yet committed to writing would appear in Andrea's follow-up emails, framed as her ideas. Campaign concepts I'd sketched in my notes would show up in her presentations with slight variations. Once or twice, I noticed turns of phrase I recognized from my own drafts in materials she submitted. I wasn't sure at first. Sometimes minds just think similarly, especially when working on the same brief. I watched, I documented. I started keeping better records. The escalation came in month 4. I was working on a comprehensive strategy document for our biggest client, a regional healthcare system that was doing a rebrand. It was a 6-week project, about 80 pages of research, personas, channel strategy, and content recommendations. I had the outline done, the first 3 sections drafted, and was knee-deep in the analysis portion when I went on a long weekend to see my family. I locked my computer, obviously. What I didn't know at the time was that I'd left a working draft open in a shared folder that Andrea had access to. Not access to that specific document, but to the folder it was temporarily in while I was reorganizing my file structure. When I came back from my long weekend, I found an email from our VP of Client Services, my manager's manager, saying he'd seen some impressive preliminary thinking on the healthcare account and that he'd like to schedule a review session. I was pleased. I hadn't sent him anything. I asked my manager, Claire, who had sent him materials. Andrea had sent him materials. Specifically, she had sent him 6 pages, a summary document that was largely based on my outline and draft, rewritten enough to change some of the specific language, but structurally identical, with the same research threads, the same client persona framework I developed, the same content pillar structure that was genuinely novel and that I had spent 2 weeks developing. I didn't go to Claire immediately. I went home and thought about it for 2 days. Then I put my copies of everything in a folder, my original outline with its creation date, my original drafts with their timestamps, and a careful comparison document showing the structural and conceptual similarities between my work and Andrea's summary. Then I waited, understanding the game. I want to explain why I waited, because the instinct is to react immediately. I've seen people react immediately to workplace injustice, and I've seen how it goes. You look emotional, you look difficult, the person you're accusing gets to play confused, and the people above you have to choose sides without evidence. Management hates having to choose sides. In the absence of clear evidence, they usually side with the person who seems calmer and more professional. If I went to Claire with accusations the week it happened, Andrea would express bafflement, say she'd developed the ideas independently, and we'd be at an impasse that made me look like the problem. What I needed was a bigger stage, and what I knew from watching Andrea operate for 4 months was that she was building towards something. She was cultivating the VP's attention. She was managing up aggressively. She was going to use this healthcare account to position herself for the promotion that was supposed to be mine. I just needed to let her set up the situation and then be ready. I also did something that I'm proud of in retrospect. I started embedding invisible markers in my work. Not literally, I didn't use anything sneaky. I just started writing genuinely distinctive idiosyncratic phrases in my documents, things that were not generic marketing language but that reflected my specific analytical voice. I added unusual structural elements. I coined a specific term, a proprietary methodology name, that I used consistently in my healthcare document. The term was distinctive enough that if it showed up in someone else's work, it was because they'd taken it from mine. I also started sending myself emails. Every significant idea I had, I'd send to my personal email with a note about what I was thinking and when. This created timestamps outside the company systems that I fully controlled. The presentation. 6 months into Andrea's tenure, the healthcare client came in for a mid-project review. This was a big meeting. The client's CMO and 2 VPs were there, plus our CEO, the VP of Client Services, Alan, my manager's manager, my manager Claire, me, and Andrea. It was the kind of meeting where careers are made or damaged. The kind of meeting where you want to be the person who shines. Andrea had been, with Alan's encouragement, positioned as the lead presenter for this meeting. I had been told I would be supporting. This was a demotion from my expected role that Claire seemed uncomfortable with, but Alan had clearly orchestrated. I believe, looking back, that Andrea had been whispering in Alan's ear for months about her vision for the account, and that he'd become a true believer. The presentation Andrea gave was my work.
not rewritten, not adapted, substantially my work, including the proprietary methodology term I had coined, the persona framework I had built, the channel strategy I developed, the content pillar architecture that was my most creative contribution to the project. She presented it fluently and confidently, and the client was impressed. Alan was beaming. Claire was watching me with an expression I couldn't quite read. And then the client's CMO, a very sharp woman in her 50s named Dr. Patricia Chow, asked a follow-up question about the persona framework. Specifically, she asked how the resonance matrix, my coined term, had been developed and what research underpinned it. She was clearly interested in potentially licensing or building on the methodology. Andrea answered, fluently and confidently and incorrectly, because she hadn't developed the framework and didn't actually know how it worked at the level Dr. Chow was asking about. She got the foundational research wrong, she misattributed one of the data sources, she described the methodology's logic in a way that was internally inconsistent. It wasn't catastrophic. Someone without technical knowledge wouldn't have caught it. But Dr. Chow's expression shifted subtly. She was a researcher. She noticed. And that's when I spoke. I said, I think there might be some confusion. Dr. Chow, would it be helpful if I walked through the research basis for the resonance matrix? I developed that component. The room went very quiet. I walked through it, correctly, completely, from memory because it was my work. I answered Dr. Chow's follow-up questions. She was visibly more satisfied. Alan was looking at Andrea with an expression that was starting to harden. After the meeting, Alan pulled me aside after the clients left. He asked what I meant by I developed that component. I said, calmly, professionally, without drama, that I had developed the majority of the strategic framework that had been presented, and that I had documentation showing dates and authorship if you'd like to review it. He looked like I'd hit him in the face with a cold fish. He had not expected this. He had, I think, constructed a story in his head about how the account was working, and I was an obstacle to it, and discovering that the story was wrong was genuinely shocking to him. I had a meeting with Claire, Alan, and HR the next afternoon. I brought the folder. I had my original files with metadata showing creation dates and authorship, my personal emails timestamping my ideas, a comparison document I'd prepared showing the structural and conceptual similarities, the proprietary term's first appearance in my documents versus its appearance in Andrea's presentation, screenshots of the shared folder access log showing that Andrea had opened my draft files during my long weekend. IT had pulled this at Claire's request after I flagged the issue, and the access log was unambiguous. HR was very quiet during the meeting, very careful, the kind of careful that means they're calculating liability. Andrea was put on administrative leave the following Monday. She resigned 2 weeks later rather than face a formal investigation. Her departure was described internally as pursuing other opportunities. I received the promotion I'd been up for, effective the following quarter. Alan was for several months afterward visibly uncomfortable in my presence, which I found quietly satisfied. He is not a bad person, I think, just someone who got taken in by a smooth operator and then found himself wrong-footed when the truth emerged. I was professionally gracious about it. Internally, I was less gracious, but internally is where that lived. The lesson about documentation. The lesson I want to share from all of this is not beware your coworkers, though that's not bad advice. It's document obsessively and early, before you need it. The moment I suspected something was wrong, I started building a case. Not because I didn't know exactly how or when I'd use it, but because I understood that in workplace conflicts, the person with documentation wins. Feelings and memories, and I told her about that idea in a meeting, are essentially worthless. Metadata and timestamps and access logs are not worthless. They are in fact exactly the kind of evidence that makes HR departments stop looking uncomfortable and start making decisions. Metadata saved me. My employer's IT systems saved me. The access log, which Andrea presumably didn't know existed or didn't think about, was the cleanest and most unambiguous evidence of the whole case. She had opened my files. The system had recorded when and by whom. That's not a he said, she said situation. That's a fact situation. Also, coin your own terms. I'm serious. If you develop a novel methodology or framework and you want to be able to prove it's yours, give it a specific, unusual name. If your name shows up in someone else's work, they have to explain why.